Thank you for this very kind introduction, Chris. Unless you have already visited the wonderful exhibition on the 5 senses, which is currently being held here at the Museum of Fine Arts, few will have heard of the Brussels artist, Michaelina Wautier. I'm exceptionally grateful to have been invited by Chris Atkins to introduce Michaelina here to you today. I'm also deeply thankful to Mrs. and Mr. Rosemarie and Eijk van Otterloo, because it is thanks to their generosity that Michaelina's 5 senses are making in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts their first public appearance after 370 years. Next to this, I'm delighted that my colleague Jeffrey Miller from Brown University, together with 6 Brown graduate students, edited a first fabulous digital publication in the series of the CNN studies to accompany this exhibition. During this lecture, we will discover the exceptionality of the series in the context of Michaelina Wautier's life and work. It's all about the series of the 5 senses you are looking at this moment. Michaelina Wautier left few paintings, no more than about 30, half of which are signed with her full name. Their variety is impressive, as you can see in this assembly, ranging from portraits, flower gardens, genre scenes, and depictions of saints to a couple of monumental history paintings. All of these works make a powerful impression in terms of format, technique, and highly individual iconography. As far as is known, Michaelina's life was free of the adversity and hardship so common in the biographies of female artists. Already in 2012, Gina Struwasser celebrated women, I quote, who met the challenge of being female professionals and succeeded as artists at a time when such accomplishments were not expected or encouraged, end of quote. How did Michaelina look like? We can be particularly happy that her self-portrait has been preserved. It provides a unique opportunity to come face to face with a female artist who can be counted among the most exceptional women of the early modern period. In her self-portrait that was painted around 1650, she radiates confidence and ambition. Her attention to teeny details, for instance, the palette, her bosom, the lace collar, and the extraordinary timepiece with the pink ribbon exemplify her power of observation. More than anyone else, she herself was convinced that she succeeded as an artist. In this respect, the historical account of Wautier's life and work can serve as a complement to a group of early modern women described by Struwasser as politically incorrect. This makes it all the more exciting to uncover the story of Michaelina's life and the uniqueness of her versatile talent. When Michaelina's life seems to have been devoid of the adversity so common in the biographies of female artists, the question remains in how far she was part of a tradition of women artists in the Netherlands. In 1567, Lodovico Guicciardini, an Italian author living in Antwerp, published his description of the Low Countries. He claimed that the Netherlands typically had quite a few women artists. He referred to several contemporary female artists, such as Maaike Bessemers Verhulst, who was the mother-in-law of Peter Bruegel the Elder, and she was a watercolorist. When Peter Bruegel the Elder died, his 2 sons were only aged 5 and 1, and it was their grandmother who taught them to paint. Another example is Catharina van Hemessen, who was the daughter of an Antwerp mannerist painter. Mary of Hungary appreciated her so much that she invited Catharina and her husband to join her at the Spanish court. Watercolors by Maaike Bessemers Verhulst has not been preserved. However, some signed paintings by Catharina van Hemessen are known. The most innovative of which is her self-portrait, dated and signed, dated 1548. The pose is based on examples from 15th century manuscript illumination, where texts by Pliny the Elder or Boccaccio were accompanied by images of women painting their own likeness. It is obvious that Michaelina has been inspired by the reputation of Netherlandish women artists of earlier generations, but none of them could even compete with her. Michaelina was born in 1614 in Mons. Mons is approximately 37 miles southwest of Brussels. She was born into a prominent family. Her father, Charles Wautier, had been a page to the Marquis de Fuentes, Viceroy of Naples. Her mother came from a patrician family of some standing. Charles Wautier, father of Michaelina, had 3 sons and 2 daughters from his first marriage and 5 sons and 2 daughters from his second. And Michaelina was one of these 2. Her father died when she was just 3 years old. As there are no indications that her mother remarried, we may assume that Michaelina grew up in a house without a father, but surrounded by brothers, half-brothers, and at least 1 sister. Her brother Charles played the most important role in her life. He was 5 years her senior, and, very important, he was also a painter. What do we know about Charles Wautier Jr., so the brother of Michaelina, and his career? And where and when did he receive his training? All we know is that he left Mons for Brussels around 1633, and that he was living in Brussels in 1642. And there he worked as a painter without having registered as a master. He apparently took a dim view of the regulations of the Brussels Guild, and he was unwilling to pay his dues. He only registered in the Brussels Guild 8 years later, at the age of 42, when the Guild obliged him to do so. In the registration entry, reference is made to his origin from Mons, and in the margin of this document is noted that, I quote, Monsieur Wautier, Mr. Wautier was trained abroad. Where exactly Charles received his artistic education is not known, but given the tradition of young painters to travel to Italy, that is probably where he trained. That Michaelina would have followed him south is less likely, if not outright impossible. Traveling back and forth from Brussels to Rome, for example, was not easy feat in those days, and keeping only male company would have compromised, undoubtedly, her reputation. This, however, does not preclude Charles from having returned from Italy with paintings and prints that could have served as a source of inspiration for both brother and sister. In light of the family situation, we can assume that they shared a workshop together. All later sources, after all, confirm that the unmarried brother and the unmarried sister lived in the same house in Brussels. In 1668, Michaelina and Charles purchased a large house near the Église de la Chapelle. Here you see Mons situated on the map, just lying in between, let's say, Amsterdam and Paris. And I was saying that they bought a beautiful house just opposite the Kapellenkerk or the Église de la Chapelle in the center of Brussels. So they bought the house together, and there's remarkable, it's also important to know that when you look at the work of Michaelina and Charles, there are remarkable stylistic resemblances. And that makes it from time to time hard to distinguish the paintings from Michaelina from those by her brother. In general, without being biased, I hope, Charles was less versatile, and the pictorial quality of his paintings is from time to time less convincing. Although this doesn't imply that he wasn't a good painter, as evidenced, for example, in this young Bacchus, preserved in Paris. Happily, there are significant differences between their signatures. While Michaelina used her first and last name in italic script to sign, as you can see here at the left. Charles' signature consisted only of the initial C and his surname in capitals. Although we know Michaelina's face, for the time being, Michaelina is a personality that shrouded in the mist of time. She died on the 1st of November 1689, and she was burned, as you can expect, in the Église La Chapelle in the center of Brussels. By then, when she died, she was 75 years old. The earliest trace of her as an artist dates from 1643. Her last known dated painting bears the date 1659. No works created with certainty during the last 30 years of her life are known. Was there some reason preventing her from continuing to work alongside her brother? We do not know. But we know that Michaelina and Charles visited their notary together on the 11th of June 1682. The fluent signature she placed under the contract suggests that she was still in good health 5 years before her death. But as far as we know, I repeat, as far as we know, she did not take a brush in hand after 1659. What makes Wautier's artistic work so unique? What did Michaelina paint between 1643 and 1650, the year she painted the Five Senses? To understand this extraordinary series of paintings, we must first focus on two examples of her earliest work. A copper engraving by Paulus Pontius of 1643, and you can also see a copy of it in the exhibition. It's an engraving after the portrait of Commander Andrea Cantelmo. It demonstrates that from the beginning of her career, Michaelina was exceptionally gifted in conveying her male sitters' powerful personalities. The original portrait was not preserved, but thanks to this subscription, with the full reference to her name, Michaelina Wautier paints it, as you see here on the slide. What means Michaelina Wautier painted it? There is no doubt that she was effectively the creator of the original portrait. At the end of the 1640s, a large-scale history painting with a religious theme seemed to come out of the blue, the mystic marriage of Saint Catherine. No other work of this nature and size is known from the years 1643-1649. However, the painting in no ways exhibits the kind of shortcomings typical of fledgling artists. The composition with the 6 life-size figures is extremely well balanced. The positioning of the group in an open landscape, the proportions of the massive bodies, and the decorative folds of their colorful robes are utterly convincing. The saints interact and seems to be conversing. The painting was hidden in a refectory of a seminary in Namur, in the south of Belgium, when it was discovered by chance thanks to the signature. Here you see where it hung in the refectory in the seminary. It was, as you could see, in a terrible condition. But in 2018, enough funding was raised to restore it. Her signature could not have been more explicit. Michaelina Wautier invenit et fecit 1649. She both invented and painted the composition. It is therefore difficult to believe that Michaelina Wautier did not paint any other history scene before 1649. Around 1650, she suddenly seems to have charted a different course. From then on, her style became more original and vigorous. In 1650, she painted the Five Senses, an ensemble that forms the focal point of the actual exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts. Tracing the series of the Five Senses has become a scavenger hunt with a very big surprise in the end. What did we know about the Five Senses by Michaelina Wautier 7 years ago? The 5 painters were twice auctioned in Valenciennes, once in 1883 and a second time in 1898. After that, all traces of them disappeared until 1975, not too long ago, where the 5 senses passed through Drouot's auction in Paris and were described as, I quote, an important series of 5 paintings of young boys, most of them signed and dated 1650. On the cover of the tin auction catalogue, 1 out of the 5 senses was reproduced in black and white. You see here a detail of this image on the cover of the catalogue. While preparing the survey exhibition devoted to Michaelina in the Mas in Antwerp in the summer of 2018, all means were deployed to track down the series. In 2017, the Rubenshuis launched a targeted campaign to find it. Flemish radio and television stations cooperated, and CODART, the Association of Curators for Dutch and Flemish Art in Museums Worldwide, also joined the search for the lost 5 senses, albeit in vain. However, in 2019, out of the blue, the 5 painting surfaced in London. A look at the image from the auction catalogue of 1975 and the newly discovered sense of hearing left no doubt. The series was offered to Christie's by a private owner and were bought in 2020 by Rosemarie and Eijk van Otterloo. The importance of the 5 senses for gaining better insight into Michaelina's oeuvre cannot be understated. The 5 fully signed and dated paintings, sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, affirm her stunning versatility and illustrate the unique way in which she conceived genre scenes. In order to understand just how exceptional her talent was, we must ask how the series fits stylistically into her oeuvre. When Michaelina painted the 5 senses in 1650, as far as we know, she had no experience in depicting genre scenes. Nevertheless, she handled the theme in an exceptionally creative way and integrated various painterly traditions. What makes her senses series so exceptional? There are 5 canvases measuring about 70 to 60 centimeters, each depicting a half-length boy. 2 of them are turned 3/4 to the left, 2 others 3/4 to the right, and the 5th one frontally, each representing one of the 5 senses. In the center, we have smell. It is represented by a boy pinching his nose with his right hand because the stench of the egg he holds is so full. He's portrayed frontally, looking at the viewer. At the left, next to him, a young flute player poses with his right arm resting on the back of a chair. This is, of course, hearing. At the far left is the allegory of sight, a boy with a pince-nez studying his left hand. On the right hand of the central painting, a boy looks at the viewer from the side. He is tasting a slice of bread in his right hand. On the far right is the depiction of touch. Sitting at the table, this boy is shown almost fully in profile, facing left. He scratches his head with his right hand, wondering how it was possible for him to have cut his left index finger with a knife. Traditionally, the senses are almost always personified by adult men. Wautier deviated from this tradition by choosing boys. It is noticeable that Wautier has painted many more boys and men than girls and women. Why? We don't know. Michaelina achieved the greatest variation by depicting 5 distinct personalities with completely different physiognomies. As far as can be assessed, they are about the same age. Only the boy with the glasses looks slightly older. In addition, the boys are characterized by different hairstyles and hair color. The boy representing sight has light brown hair. The flute player has dark brown to black hair. Blonde hair peeks out from under the cap of taste. The boy with a slice of bread has ashen blonde hair, while the boy who has hurt himself has yet black hair. In these scenes from 1650, Michaelina parades all her expertise in realistically depicting curly, wavy, or straight hair. Her fascination with rendering hair would only increase, and it would become a hallmark of all her later paintings. What sources of inspiration did Michaelina have at her disposal in 1650 when she painted this series? The depiction of the five senses was very popular in both the painterly and the graphic tradition. After all, the theme was eminently recognizable, and it allowed artists great iconographic freedom, ranging from humanist interpretations to representations rife with sexual allusions. For an extremely inspiring contextual approach of 17th century philosophical theories of the senses and its relation to Michaelina, I refer to the excellent exhibition catalogue edited by Geoffrey Muller, I referred to before. And I'm very pleased that Geoffrey is also attending this lecture. Thank you very much for being here. Until now, it has always been assumed that Michaelina's inspiration may well have come from Michael Sweerts, a painter also active in Brussels, who was about the same age as Wautier and who for decades has been regarded as the groundbreaking artist in Brussels. Sweerts too painted attractive representations of young boys as personifications of five senses, such as, for example, the allegory of taste. Recent research, however, has shown that it was the other way around, and that it was in fact Wautier who influenced Sweerts during his Brussels period. Both Geoffrey Muller and Yannick Etundi, as well as one of our PhD students, Kirsten Derks, she will defend her PhD in the beginning of June, and I'm extremely pleased that I can say that she will be one of the future fellows of the CNA. Kirsten came at the same moment to the same conclusion, namely that Wautier was indeed the source of inspiration for Sweerts, which makes Wautier's position in Brussels as an artist even more important and more impressive. Nor is it certain whether Michaelina was familiar with, for example, González Cox, the best-known Antwerp painter of series of the five senses. His 5 panels are remarkably small and contain hidden portraits of contemporary artists. A good example, here at the left, is the allegory of touch, a likeness of the Antwerp artist Pieter Meert. This set by Cox dates from the years 1640, 1645, and thus precedes Michaelina's series. Nevertheless, the allegories of adult men differ so much typologically that it is really unlikely that they formed a point of departure for her. Looking for truly related images, one sooner ends up in the northern Netherlands. In Haarlem, for example, from the 1620s onwards, representations of the senses were made on individual supports and in a larger format. It is noteworthy that children were chosen for the personifications. Similar scenes are known by Jan Miensel Molenaar, by Frans Hals and Judith Leister. They are distinguished by the lively interpretation of children with a natural expression and often colorful incidental details. Molenaar's boy smoking and holding a wine glass dates from around 1625-29 and was originally part of a series of the senses. 2 attributes, the wine-filled rumour and the pipe, refer to taste. It is quite possible that Frans Hals' singing boy with flute, dated around 1627, can also be read as an allegory of the sense of hearing. Iconographically and regarding composition, Michaelina's flute player dovetails neatly with this Haarlem type. The young flute player by Judith Leister, from around 1635, is associated with the sense of hearing. Analyzing the clothing of the boys in Wautier's senses, It turns out to be very similar to that of the youths in the Haarlem tradition. The prototypes of Caravaggio's motley youngsters served as a point of departure for the decorative genre scenes by Utrecht Caravaggists, such as, for example, Hendrik ter Bruggen, who in turn inspired the Haarlem artist. It is nevertheless remarkable that the palette of the Haarlem genre scenes was much more limited, only embellished with a few colorful accents. This may also be related to the fact that the models usually came from lower income circles. This latter aspect is also evident in Michaelina's 5 senses. 2 of the 5 boys wear a cloak draped over their chests. The flute player has a plain scarf tied around his neck, and the boy with the axe stands out because of his worn clothing. A piece is missing from the brim of his head, and the cuffs and sleeves of the cloak look as if they have had their best days. Dirty nails, for example, are commonplace. Such boys with tattered clothes seem to have escaped also, might be escaped from the paintings of the French artist Louis Lenain was in line with the Haarlem artist, and he tended to depict youngsters in all kinds of genre scenes, as you see here. The type of boys is surprisingly similar to the models Michaelina used for her 5 senses. His small card players, here at the right, from around 1636, 1640, is a good example of this. The beret with the plume and the draped cloak serve as a kind of guideline for the portrayal of the young models. The series of the 5 senses fits perfectly well within Michaelina's oeuvre. She painted genre scenes in which this type of boy played the leading role throughout, in fact, her active period. The scene, for example, with the bubbling boys, preserved in Seattle, shows a same type of boys. In fact, they seem to be brothers of the boys, personifying the 5 senses. Also, in the playful paraphrase with the 2 boys, another genre scene by Michaelina, you can see that the boys are really comparable. Michaelina lavished attention on supple color contrast, whereby they can be dated shortly after 1650, thus somewhat later than the 5 senses. I'll show them again. Here you have the bubbling boys. Here you see the full scene, and you see in which way they can be compared with the boys of the 5 senses, and we have a comparable situation when we look at the 2 boys in regard to paintings by part of the cycle of the 5 senses. The 5 senses series is a unique expression of Michaelina Wautier's powers of observation. The boys who served as models for these 5 depictions were undoubtedly registered from life. Because they appear to be ordinary boys, it is obvious that the artist sought out appropriate models. This begs the question whether she and her brother Charles had their own studio where the boys would pose for them. The great interest in drawing from life in Brussels as a basis for all artistic activity is clear from the Drawing Academy, a painting by Michael Sweerts representing the Academy, by Michael Sweerts after he returned to Brussels. Sweerts' drawing school from around 1655 gives an idea of how such sessions were organized. Michaelina Wautier succeeded in reconciling various traditions in her series of the 5 senses. She worked in Brussels and was undoubtedly familiar with the Antwerp Baroque tradition. In addition, she must have come into contact in one way or another with paintings from the northern Netherlands, as we have seen. How this happened remains an open question. Antwerp was the hub of the European art market in the first half of the 17th century, and the presence in Brussels of Archduke collector Leopold Wilhelm, with whom Michaelina had direct or indirect contact, as we will see, must have stimulated the circulation of paintings For sure, inventive, developed and talented as Wautier was, she will have profited from the rich supply in Antwerp and Brussels. Her 5 senses demonstrate that by 1650 she was already well advanced in her career, producing avant-garde genre paintings which became a source of inspiration for the most important contemporary artist in Brussels, Michael Sweerts. What do we know more about this period in Wautier's life and career? I'm referring to the year 1650. Coincidentally, a unique source has been preserved from exactly the same year, the year in which the census were creating, demonstrating that Michaelina was already well known at the court of the Archduke in those days. Courtiers in Brussels were expected to be accomplished dancers. Accordingly, an excellent French dancing master was attached to the court, who instructed members of the nobility for over 40 years. Himself a dancer, Adam Pierre de la Grenée bore the title of Maître de Danse, Master of Dance. He entered Leopold Wilhelm's service in 1649. In his journal, he recorded the names of the people he had instructed. From this exceptional source, we can form an idea of his diverse clientele, including, for example, the son of the King of Denmark and the Duke of Buckingham. The dancing master also collected paintings by 16th and 17th century Flemish masters. At the back of his journal, he diligently recorded the names of the artists from whom he bought paintings. He noted their subjects and the prices. On the 17th of January, 1650, he wrote in his journal that he had bought 2 pictures by Mademoiselle Wautier, a depiction of a Bacchus and a depiction of a Nicodemus. Of primary importance is the fact that he, de la Grenée, the master of dance, was active in the very heart of the court in Brussels. He knew, apparently, Mademoiselle Wautier. He knew her as an artist and had bought 3 works by her. Moreover, this source establishes that Michaelina was known in Archduke Leopold Wilhelm's immediate proximity. Based on the description, the type of painting she sold to de la Grenée were completely different from the 5 senses. On the basis of the prices, we may assume that they were about the same size. This conclusion immediately raises other questions. If Michaelina worked for the free market, where did she offer her paintings? Did she receive potential clients in her house? Did she have the opportunity to show her pictures elsewhere? Were the 5 senses commissioned, or was the theme so appealing that she took the initiative herself, certain that the series would sell well? And what happened after the completion of the 5 senses? How did her work evolve after 1650? In 1652, Michaelina painted 2 flower still lifes, the only ones known to exist by her. The 2 garlands betray her keen observation of nature and expertise and involve a subtlety that complements her usual firmness. Here you see the 2 flower garlands, the first, the second, and then you see them together. Their exquisite quality is surprising because Michaelina was never, as far as we know, a true flower painter, like so many others of her peers. The verso of the flower garland with a butterfly bears the Antwerp panel marker's hallmark. You see, when you have very good eyes, you can recognize, I hope, the castle of Antwerp and the 2 hands above it. It is therefore certain that Wautier bought these panels in Antwerp. This is interesting because it indicates that she had connections with Antwerp and may have spent time there. The iconography of the pendants is exceptional and again proves Michaelina's erudition and originality. For the classic motif, festoons suspended between the skulls of oxen, She drew inspiration from ancient monuments, such as the Areopagus Augustae in Rome. Here, too, the question remains as to how she became familiar with these sources. The macro-XRF scanning of Wautier's garlands with flowers, conducted by Kirsten Derks in the context of her PhD research, has revealed much about Michaelina's working methods, because several pentimenti have been discovered. Her garlands offer the opportunity to say very briefly also something about the evolution of the prices of Michaelina's works. In 1993, in Amsterdam, one of these garlands of flowers was sold for about 14,000 euros. In 2019, the pendant with the dragonfly changed hands for nearly $500,000. The financial rating is not important as such, but it is very important as an indication of the increasing appreciation of Wautier's paintings and demonstrates that she is taken seriously as an artist and has managed to join the canon of art history over a period of 30 years. In the period 53-55, Michaelina produced some of her most original portraits. The portrait of the Jesuit Martino Martini, dated 1655, marks a turning point in her oeuvre. The Jesuit's Chinese name is written on the painting in good Chinese calligraphy. Martini, seen unusually in three-quarter view to the right, looks straight ahead without seeking eye contact with the viewer. The power of this portrait lies in the combination of the sitter's physiognomy and his imposing body. The palette is limited, but the silky sheen of his Chinese robe is rendered in numerous tonal variations. Falling over the breast of the sitter are the deep, dark folds of a blue silk tabard. Once again, the eye is drawn to the way in which Martini's hair has been painted. His locks and beard are beginning to gray, and the subtle gradations are stunningly suggested. This is the only lifelike portrait of the Jesuit that is known. A comparison with an anonymous portrait of the same man preserved in Trento, dating from 1661, demonstrates the overwhelming superiority of her observation and expression capability. Within the category of undated works, the portrait by Michaelina of the saints Agnes and Dorothy, with its intimate atmosphere and colorful palette, holds a special place. There is no eye contact between them, yet they lean slightly towards each other, seeming unaware of the viewer's presence. Michaelina convincingly emphasizes their vulnerability through the blush on their cheeks. The individualized facial features leave little doubt that the picture should be interpreted as a portrait historié, a type of a portrait in which the sitters are represented as historical or mythological figures, or, in the present case, as saints. Behind them, the dark space is closed off by a section of a curtain draped in ample folds. Recent research using macro-XRF analysis has shown that the initial background looked rather different. I go back for one moment. So look at the portrait and just focus on the curtain behind the two girls. And here you see that the initial background looked probably different. From the scan, it becomes evident that the deep red curtain initially stretched as far as the red tablecloth, which must have given the painting a completely different appearance. Was it Wautier herself who modified and rearranged the palette, or was it the result of a later invention by another hand? We do not know. The red would have made an emphatic contrast with the subtle color in the clothing of the two Virgin Martyrs. Thanks to imaging technology, a reconstruction could be made of the original color palette. The gown of Saint Dorothy now looks greenish, but apparently it looked more blue at first. Her clothing refers to contemporary fashion, especially the wide folded sleeves. I will go back to the entire scene. The collar cutout, the brooches on the shoulders, as well as the pearl necklace and the bracelet. The custom provides a starting point for the dating of the picture around 1650 or 65. The costume of Saint Agnes, in contrast, can't be related to 17th century fashion. Her voluminous yellow mantle is made of a heavy fabric that descends to the ground in broad swaths. She has draped an oriental scarf around her shoulders and put up her hair in braids. Her clothing is timeless, and unlike Dorothy, she lacks jewelry. The richly impastoed paint layers of this double portrait is impressive and of exceptional quality. The painting urgently needs restoration, which will be possible thanks to the TEFAF Museum Restoration Fund, as was announced at the most recent TEFAF event. The figures are modeled with assured brushstrokes, and the characterization of Saint Agnes' face is very similar to that of Mary in the Education of the Virgin. A painting fully signed and dated 1656. In this painting, the figures of Anne and Joachim appear to be sculpted with light. Their tawny faces contrast with the more diffusely illuminated face of Mary. A great deal of attention has been paid to the hands, which, just as in the mystic marriage of 1649, are typical of Wautier's work. The interaction between the figures is underscored by the way in which they are touching each other. 4 years later, Michaelina painted another religious painting, fully signed and dated 1659. The Annunciation, preserved in Louveciennes, not too far from Versailles, is one of Michaelina's most important paintings, and it occupies a special place in her oeuvre because it is the latest dated work by her that is currently known. It was produced exactly 10 years after the mystic marriage of St. Catherine, her earliest known history painting. The two figures are life-size. The light enters from the left to illuminate Mary's womb, the place of conception. Her gown is simple, caught in at her waist by a twisted ribbon. Only the deep blue mantle underlines the extraordinary role she is destined to play. It seems as if the angel's abrupt arrival has caused it to slip from her shoulders and pull around her feet. This Annunciation takes place in a plain room where the nails in the floorboards are still visible. The provenance of the Annunciation, now in Louveciennes, is very complicated, but it can't be excluded that the painting might be identified with a painting of an Annunciation by Michaelina, once decorating the Church of the Discalled Carmelites in Mechelen, where in the 18th century this painting was exposed opposite a crucifixion by her brother Charles Wautier. In 1659, Michaelina was 45 years old and could look back on a fruitful career as a painter of religious and mythological works, portraits, jar pieces, and still lifes. The question that comes up is, for whom were these works intended? The investment required to make portraits or jar scenes was relatively small. Probably Michaelina was wealthy enough and could easily afford the necessary materials. This was quite different with respect to altarpieces, such as the Education of the Virgin and the Annunciation, and even much more the case for the Triumph of Bacchus, one of Michaelina's paintings that is just over 3.5 meters wide. This canvas would have filled a room and required labor-intensive and precise work. The subject, incidentally, is so specific that not every patron would have wanted it. It is unlikely that Michaelina devised such a concept on her own initiative. It makes more sense that she was commissioned to paint a monumental composition of the Triumph of Bacchus, commissioned to paint it with life-size figures. Because the painting was inventoried in Leopold Wilhelm's collection in Vienna in 1659, it seems logical to assume that he granted her this commission. Leopold Wilhelm, Archduke, was governor of the Spanish Netherlands between 1647 and 1656. He's always presented as a paragon of devotion and as a lover of the arts. You see here a representation of his collection, and he is standing in the middle. You can compare his personality also with the portrait painted of him by Pieter Thijs. His picture collection consisted for 1/3 of religious painting, but this implies that 2/3 of the collection depicted profane scenes. His interest in Italian and Flemish painting meant that mythological themes were abundantly represented. If during his sojourn in Brussels, Leopold Wilhelm engaged Michaelina to paint the Bacchus scene, one wonders whether and to what extent she was given explicit instructions. How it was actually made remains a mystery. Did Wautier make a sketch? Was an external prototype used? Could the artist decide freely how to work up the composition? One thing is clear, Wautier's painting is astonishingly original. The composition is, as you can see, dominated by 10 life-size figures, passing from right to left in an open landscape. In the middle of the composition, a satyr pushes a wheelbarrow on which Bacchus lies. The goat-legged satyr can most likely be identified as Silenus, stepfather of Bacchus, who is always portrayed with a fat belly seated on a donkey. Michaelina depicted only the head of the donkey next to him. Silenus here appears not as a down-and-out merrymaker with a fat belly, but rather as a greybeard, worn down by life, who closely resembles the saints she also painted for Leopold Wilhelm, such as Saint Joseph. Almost all of the figures face left, creating the impression that the retinue is in motion. On the far left, a grey-haired man pulls the wheelbarrow forward with a double rope. 6 children, or little satyrs, disport themselves walking with the procession. Tracks are visible in the ground. A dog is barking in the left foreground, and the hilly landscape is visible in the distance. Except for the woman on the far right, none of the figures look out at the viewer. They are too absorbed in their own activities. It is Michaelina herself who includes herself as the spectator's accomplice. She derived inspiration from antique sculptures, such as bacchantes, standing in contrapposto, as are often found in Hellenistic sculptures. For that matter, Michaelina was inspired more than once by antique prototypes. There's a drawing by her hand, for example, of an ancient modello of a Nike. Familiarity with the classical tradition, remember the skulls of oxen holding the garlands of the flowers, was highly exceptional for female artists. Next to this, she was inspired by 17th century emblematic books, such as Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. The children, besides Michaelina's alter ego, in the painting, are playing with a billy goat, as you can see here, an animal traditionally regarded as a symbol of lust. In the illustrated edition of Ripa's collection of emblems, published in 1603, the personification of lust, libidine, poses besides a billy goat, just as Michaelina is doing. The portraits of male sitters mentioned earlier, such as Martino Martini, illustrate that the artist could render male bodies like no other. And then she suddenly painted a picture populated by almost only nude men. It is as though she wanted to do away with the old chestnut that women were incapable of rendering male corporality. For the procession, she selected men of different ages. I'll go back for a moment. She selected men of different ages, with various skin tones and from all weight classes. Young boys too enlivened the scene with their unrestrained gesticulation. The mythological figures are set in a timeless virtual space. By gazing out of the painting, Wautier is seeking a connection with contemporary reality, and she is the only one. It has become clear before that the dance master, Pierre Adam de la Grenée, who had been invited to the court by the Archduke, already bought paintings made by Mademoiselle Wautier in 1650, exactly the year in which she painted also the Five Senses. Next to this, it cannot be otherwise than that Wautier was commissioned to paint the Triumph of Bacchus by Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, somewhere in the mid-50s, and that after completion it was sent to Vienna, where it was registered in his collection in 1659. It cannot be otherwise than that it was the Archduke himself who encouraged her pictorial ambition and challenged her artistic intelligence. Gina Strumwasser celebrated women who succeeded as artists at a time when such accomplishments were not expected or encouraged. The last thing the Archduke could have predicted is that it would take almost 4 centuries before others also discovered her genius. It is not known how the monumental painting of Triumph of Bacchus was moved from Brussels to Vienna. I suppose it must be rolled up. But we know how complex it has been to bring the canvas back to Belgium. On occasion of the exhibition Michaelina, Baroque's Leading Lady in Antwerp, a crane was needed to transport it to the 2nd floor of the museum. In the exhibition, the bust of the Archduke, not without reason, guarded the huge painting. The first exhibition ever on Michaelina Wautier in 2018 in Antwerp meant the first discovery of her impressive artistic personality. But her fame only crossed the ocean thanks to the first ever US show in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It is this exhibition that brought her to the cover of the New York Times in December 2022. As a politically incorrect woman, Michaelina Wautier managed to convince contemporary art lovers. Later on, politically correct people succeeded in damaging her reputation so much that Michaelina Wautier's fame faded away in a short time. When her fabulous Five Senses were offered for sale in 1975, in the paper-thin auction catalogue, the artist is referred to as Michaelina Wautier. The author of these 5 paintings is an artist about whom little is known. Fortunately, those days are gone forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaelina, for that amazing walk through Michaelina's oeuvre, really fantastic. I also want to thank the Government of Flanders for their generous sponsorship of this event, and thanks to all of you for attending this evening. If you are interested in future programming from the CNA, sign up for our newsletter at cna@mfa.org, and I hope you have the chance to enjoy the exhibition again and again. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Thank you.